Elena settled into her seat in the middle row, feeling the familiar tug of disinterest as she glanced around the crowded cabin. She was sandwiched between David on her right and a stranger on her left. David was busy struggling with his seatbelt, his thinning hair plastered to his forehead in the humid cabin. She barely noticed when he finally managed to secure himself and slumped into his seat with a tired sigh. "This is going to be good for us," David said, forcing a smile. "We need this." Elena didn't bother responding. She turned her attention to the overhead screen as the safety video played, her mind already miles away from the flight, from David, and from the marriage that felt like a lifeless routine. The trip was supposed to rekindle something between them, but she had long since given up on that hope. She was simply going through the motions. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Elena felt the weight of David's hand resting lightly on her thigh. She resisted the urge to push it away, instead shifting slightly in her seat to avoid his touch. It was a subtle move, but David didn't seem to notice, or maybe he chose to ignore it. As the plane took off and the cabin lights dimmed, Elena became acutely aware of the man sitting to her left. She hadn't paid him much attention when she first sat down, but now, with the plane settling into its cruising altitude, she found herself glancing his way. He was strikingly handsome, tall, dark, and with a presence that commanded attention. His sharp jawline and well-groomed appearance stood in stark contrast to David's unkempt and tired look. The man caught her glance and turned slightly, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. Elena felt a spark of interest flare up inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She quickly looked away, but not before noticing the slight smirk that played on his lips. He knew the effect he had on her, and he wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. David, oblivious to the silent exchange happening right next to him, was already dozing off. His head lolled to the side, and a soft snore escaped his lips. Elena looked at him for a moment, feeling nothing but a growing impatience. She turned her attention back to the stranger on her left, who was now casually sipping from a glass of red wine, his eyes still on her. The man leaned slightly closer, his voice low and smooth. "Long flight?" he said, his accent unmistakably Italian. "Perhaps it could be more enjoyable with some company." Elena's pulse quickened. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the sheer magnetism of his presence. She hadn't felt this alive in years, and the dull ache of her marriage suddenly seemed like a distant memory. She glanced at David, still asleep, completely unaware, and then back at the man. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "Luca," he replied, his lips curling into a smile. "And you?" "Elena," she said, returning the smile. It felt dangerous, thrilling even, to be having this conversation while David slept inches away. But that only added to the excitement. Their conversation flowed easily, each exchange laden with unspoken innuendo. Luca's charm was undeniable, and Elena found herself drawn to his confidence and the way he made her feel noticed, desired even. She had almost forgotten what that felt like. David shifted in his sleep, mumbling something unintelligible, but neither Elena nor Luca paid him any attention. They were in their own world, the cramped confines of the airplane cabin seeming to disappear as the connection between them deepened. Luca leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "I think this flight just got a lot more interesting," he whispered. Elena felt a thrill run through her. She knew she should feel guilty, but all she felt was a surge of adrenaline. She hadn't felt this alive in years, and she wasn't about to let the moment slip away. She returned Luca's gaze, her smile widening. The spark had been ignited, and there was no turning back now. David's hand slipped from her thigh as he settled deeper into sleep, completely oblivious to the tension crackling between his wife and the man on her left. Elena glanced at him briefly, then turned back to Luca. The excitement bubbling inside her was impossible to ignore. The plane's engines droned on as the flight attendants began their service, but Elena barely noticed. All she could think about was the man beside her and the possibilities that lay ahead. This trip, which she had dreaded, was suddenly full of potential. Dangerous, exciting potential. Luca raised his glass slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. To new adventures, he said softly. Elena hesitated for only a moment before reaching for her own glass, clinking it against his. To new adventures, she echoed, her heart pounding in her chest. David stirred beside her, but Elena didn't care. She was already lost in the thrill of what was to come. David stirred beside Elena, blinking groggily as he slowly woke up. He rubbed his eyes, yawned, and glanced around the dimly lit cabin. Looks like I dozed off, he muttered, his voice thick with sleep. Elena didn't respond, her attention still half focused on Luca, who was now flipping through a magazine, his strong hands turning the pages with casual ease. The subtle scent of his cologne lingered in the air between them, a sharp contrast to the stale smell of the airplane cabin. David, oblivious to everything as usual, leaned back in his seat and sighed. This reminds me of that time we flew to Chicago, he began, his tone flat and uninspired. Remember that? The time the flight got delayed for 6 hours and we were stuck at the airport? Elena stifled a groan. Of course she remembered. He had told the story a dozen times and each retelling was more tedious than the last. She glanced at Luca, who was now engrossed in his magazine, paying no attention to David's droning voice. Yeah, she said, barely masking her disinterest. I remember. David didn't notice her lack of enthusiasm. You were so mad, he continued, chuckling to himself. I tried to calm you down, but you were ready to start a riot at the gate. And then when we finally got on the plane, they lost our luggage. What a nightmare that was. Elena nodded absently, her mind drifting back to Luca. She wondered what his life was like, what kind of stories he had to tell. Stories that were probably full of excitement, passion, and adventure, not the dull, predictable anecdotes David always seemed to cling to. David kept talking, his voice a constant, monotonous drone. And then there was that time in Vegas when Elena tuned him out completely. She didn't care about Vegas, Chicago, or any of the other places they'd been together. Those trips were just like this one, pointless attempts to rekindle something that had long since died. David's stories were relics of a life she no longer wanted, memories of a time when she might have cared, but didn't anymore. She glanced at Luca again, feeling that familiar thrill. His presence was magnetic, pulling her away from the boring reality of her life. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so alive, so aware of everything around her. Luca had awakened something in her that David had long since buried. David was still talking, oblivious to the way Elena's mind had drifted far from his words. Remember when we stayed at that bed and breakfast in Vermont? The one with the creaky floors and the weird old lady who kept offering us cookies. Elena rolled her eyes, careful to keep her expression neutral. David always brought up Vermont. That trip had been his idea of a romantic getaway, but all she remembered was the cold, the uncomfortable bed, and the endless chatter of the innkeeper. It was just another example of how out of touch David was with what she really wanted. She glanced at her watch, hoping he'd take the hint and wrap it up, but he just kept going. I wonder if that place is still open. Maybe we could go back sometime, for old time's sake. Elena forced a smile, but inside she was counting the minutes until David would finally drift off again. Maybe, she said, her voice devoid of any real interest. David yawned and stretched, finally seeming to run out of steam. Yeah, maybe, he mumbled, his eyes drooping. Elena silently willed him to close them, to fall back into the oblivion of sleep where he wouldn't be a distraction from the thoughts that truly excited her. Luca glanced over at her then, catching her eye for just a moment. It was a brief, fleeting connection, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. She smiled at him, a silent promise of things to come, before turning back to David, who was finally nodding off again. As his breathing evened out, Elena felt a wave of relief. The dull drone of his voice was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of the plane and the intoxicating presence of Luca beside her. She didn't bother pretending to care about David anymore. He was asleep and in his dreams. Maybe he was the hero of his own stories. But in the real world, he was just a boring man who couldn't hold her attention, let alone her heart. Elena's thoughts returned to Luca, who had closed his magazine and was now sipping his drink, his eyes lazily scanning the cabin. She didn't care what David had to say, didn't care about the past or the future. All she cared about was the thrill of the moment, the excitement that came from knowing something dangerous was about to happen. She glanced at David one last time, confirming he was truly asleep, before letting herself fully engage with Luca's presence. The anticipation was almost unbearable, but in the best way possible. The game was still on, and Elena was more than ready to play. Luca leaned in closer, his voice low and smooth, capturing Elena's attention instantly. "There was a time in Venice," he began, his accent making every word sound like a caress. "I was there for the carnival, a festival that transforms the city into something magical. The streets are filled with people in masks, everyone pretending to be someone else. It's the perfect place to lose yourself." Elena listened intently, his words painting vivid pictures in her mind. She imagined the narrow, winding streets of Venice, the masked faces, the thrill of anonymity. Luca's voice was like velvet, rich and warm, pulling her into the story with every syllable. He continued, describing the night he spent on a gondola, the city lit up by the glow of 1,000 lanterns. "The canals were like mirrors," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, reflecting the lights, the colors, the masks. And in that moment, everything felt like a dream, like anything was possible. Elena was entranced. She could almost smell the salt water of the canals, feel the gentle sway of the gondola beneath her feet. Luca's story was spellbinding, a far cry from the mundane tales David always told. This was different. This was alive. But as Luca spoke, Elena found her attention drifting, not away from him, but deeper into him. She was no longer just listening, she was feeling. His voice, his presence, his scent, it was all too much. She couldn't focus on the details of the story anymore. All she could think about was Luca, about the way his hand rested casually on the armrest between them, just inches from hers. Her mind wandered. What would his hands feel like on her skin? Strong, sure, confident. She could imagine them, the way they would trace the curve of her waist, the way they would hold her, the way they would take what they wanted. Her breathing quickened, and she had to remind herself to stay still, to keep listening, but it was becoming impossible. Luca's story wove on, talking of a masked woman he met on that gondola, a mysterious figure who disappeared into the night without a word. But Elena was no longer following the tale. Her eyes were fixed on his hands, those hands that now seemed to move in slow motion, teasing her with their nearness. Without realizing it, she leaned closer to him, her shoulder brushing against his. Luca didn't pause, didn't falter in his story, but she noticed the slight twitch of a smile at the corner of his mouth. He knew exactly what he was doing to her. Her fingers, almost of their own accord, moved toward him. She touched his arm just lightly at first, as if testing the waters. His skin was warm under her touch, his muscles firm. The contact sent a jolt through her, a rush of heat that settled low in her belly. Luca continued speaking, his voice a constant, steady flow, but Elena was no longer listening to the words. She was lost in the sensation of her fingers tracing his forearm, moving slowly, exploring the contours of his muscles. She inched closer, her breath catching as she let her hand drift lower, over his wrist, toward his thigh. The cabin around them seemed to fade away, the quiet hum of the plane becoming nothing more than background noise. All that existed was Luca, his presence enveloping her, pulling her deeper into his orbit. She let her hand slide down, brushing against his leg, feeling the heat of him through the fabric of his trousers. Her heart pounded in her chest as her fingers found the zipper of his pants, the metal cool against her skin. She hesitated just for a moment, her pulse racing with anticipation. She glanced up at Luca, her eyes meeting his, and she saw the flicker of something dark and dangerous in his gaze. But she continued. Without a word, without breaking the rhythm of his story, Luca shifted slightly, just enough to press into her hand, his meaning clear. Elena swallowed hard, her throat dry, but there was no turning back now. The thrill of what she was doing, of what was about to happen, was intoxicating. She let her fingers explore, feeling the outline of what was hidden behind his trousers, the hard evidence of his desire. Her breath quickened, her entire body tingling with anticipation. The world outside their small bubble was irrelevant. Nothing mattered except this moment, this connection, this forbidden thrill. Luca's voice never wavered, his story weaving on, but the words had lost their meaning to Elena. All she could focus on was the feel of him, the heat building between them, the inevitable collision that was drawing closer with every passing second. David stirred in his sleep, but Elena didn't even notice. She was too far gone, too wrapped up in the excitement of Luca, in the forbidden pleasure that awaited her just inches away. Elena glanced at Luca, an unspoken understanding passing between them. With her heart pounding, she stood and made her way down the aisle toward the back of the plane. Luca followed, his quiet confidence making her pulse quicken. The cabin was dim, most of the passengers asleep or lost in their own thoughts. David's soft snores faded into the background. Reaching the small, cramped restroom, Elena glanced around nervously before stepping inside. Moments later, Luca joined her, his presence filling the space. The door clicked shut, and the tension that had been building between them came to a head. Their eyes met, and without a word, he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. Elena felt a surge of emotions, excitement, longing, and a sense of abandon she hadn't felt in years. She returned the kiss, her hands resting lightly on his chest, as his warmth enveloped her. The confined space seemed to magnify every sensation, the whisper of his breath, the light touch of his hands as they found her waist, and the heady scent of his cologne. Time felt suspended as they embraced, the hum of the plane outside the door a distant memory. Luca's touch was confident but restrained, his hands guiding her with a deliberate care that left her breathless. He held her close, their connection deepening with every passing moment. The thrill of their closeness was intoxicating, and for the first time in years, Elena felt alive, truly alive. They broke apart briefly, their foreheads resting together as they caught their breath. Elena's heart raced as she looked into Luca's eyes, which held a mixture of desire and understanding. There were no words spoken. None were needed. A soft knock at the door startled them, pulling them back to reality. Luca straightened, his expression calm, though his eyes still sparkled with unspoken promises. He opened the door slightly, ensuring the coast was clear, before slipping out with a small, knowing smile. Elena took a moment to compose herself, her reflection in the mirror showing flushed cheeks and a glow she hadn't seen in years. She adjusted her clothes and stepped back into the aisle, returning to her seat as if nothing had happened. David was still asleep, oblivious to everything, his soft snores a sharp contrast to the wild encounter Elena had just experienced. She settled into her seat, her breathing slowly returning to normal, but the thrill of what had happened still pulsed through her veins. "Fine," Elena replied, her tone light. She glanced at Luca, who was already flipping through the in-flight magazine, his calm demeanor betraying none of the excitement they had shared. Elena leaned back in her seat, her thoughts racing as the plane continued its journey. What had just happened felt like a dream, but the spark it ignited within her was undeniable. She glanced once more at Luca, who met her gaze with a subtle smile before turning her attention to the window. The night outside was quiet and vast, but for Elena, everything felt new and alive again. David stirred beside Elena, blinking his eyes open as the first rays of dawn filtered through the airplane windows. He stretched and yawned, looking around to get his bearings. "We're almost there, huh?" he mumbled, glancing at the screen showing their progress. The plane was descending, the destination not far off. Elena nodded, adjusting her seatbelt as she settled back. Her body still hummed with the remnants of her encounter with Luca, but she kept her expression neutral, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. David turned to Luca, who was casually reading the in-flight magazine, completely composed. "Hey, I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself earlier," David said, offering a hand. "I'm David, Elena's husband. Thanks for keeping her company during the flight." Luca smiled, shaking David's hand firmly. "Luca, it was my pleasure." Elena is wonderful company. David chuckled, completely oblivious to the double meaning in Luca's words. Well, I appreciate it. I must have slept through half the flight. I hope I didn't snore too loudly. Elena smiled, giving Luca a sideways glance. No worries, David. Luca and I managed just fine. David laughed, relaxing back into his seat. Good to hear. This has been a long flight. I guess I needed the rest. As the plane began its final descent, David unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, stretching his legs. I'm going to hit the restroom before we land, he said, heading toward the back of the plane. Elena watched him go, exchanging a brief, knowing look with Luca. They both remained silent, the cabin filled with the quiet hum of the descending aircraft. A few minutes later, David returned, a perplexed look on his face. Something weird happened back there, he said, shaking his head as he sat down. The sink in the toilet is broken. Like, really broken. Hanging off the wall. I had to be careful not to knock it down completely. Elena raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. Really? Must have been some rough turbulence while you were sleeping. David's eyes widened, and he let out a hearty laugh. No kidding. Wow. I must have had the deadliest sleep ever. Didn't even feel a thing. Elena joined in the laughter, glancing at Luca, who smirked knowingly. Yeah, she said, her voice steady. It was strong and rough turbulence, all right. David shook his head, still chuckling. I'll say, guess I missed all the action. Good thing you two were awake to keep an eye on things. Elena just smiled, leaning back as the plane touched down on the runway, the wheels screeching as they made contact with the ground. The flight had been long, but it was over now, and what happened in the air was left behind. As the plane taxied to the gate, David sighed in contentment. Well, we made it. Time to start fresh, huh? Elena nodded, her thoughts elsewhere, but she offered him a smile. Yeah, time to start fresh. David grinned, completely unaware of the hidden meaning in her words. Luca simply watched, his expression unreadable, as they waited for the plane to come to a stop. When the doors finally opened, David stood up, stretching his arms. Let's go, he said cheerfully. Elena followed him, Luca close behind as they made their way off the plane. What happened on that flight stayed on that flight, just as it was meant to.